Sometimes the worst news of your life arrives on the same day as the miracle you never expected. Emily Carter had no idea that by lunchtime, everything she believed about her future would be gone. Tuesday mornings at the accounting firm were always predictable. The soft hum of printers filled the office. Keyboards clicked in steady rhythms. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the open workspace on the 21st floor overlooking downtown Chicago. Emily liked predictable. After everything that had happened during the past 6 months, predictable felt safe. She sat at her desk reviewing expense reports, her blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a half-finished cup of coffee growing cold beside her monitor. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray clouds gathered above the city skyline. The weather forecast had promised rain by evening. Emily barely noticed. Her attention stayed fixed on the numbers in front of her. Lately, she had been tired more often than usual. Not exhausted exactly. Just drained. She blamed the long hours. The divorce. The endless process of rebuilding a life she never expected to lose. Across the office, coworkers chatted quietly about weekend plans. Someone laughed near the break room. Another phone rang. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. Emily blinked and stared at the spreadsheet on her screen. The numbers seemed strangely blurry. She rubbed her temples. A dull ache pulsed behind her eyes. Maybe she needed lunch. Maybe she needed more sleep. For a few seconds, she simply sat still, waiting for the feeling to pass. Instead, the room seemed to tilt. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly felt too bright. The sounds around her became distant, muffled, as if she were hearing them through a closed door. She reached for the edge of her desk. Her fingers tightened against the wood. A coworker nearby glanced over. "Emily? You okay?" Emily tried to answer. The words never came. The floor beneath her feet seemed to disappear. Gasps echoed through the office as her chair rolled backward. Papers scattered across the carpet. Someone rushed forward. Another employee grabbed a phone. Voices overlapped. Concern replaced routine in an instant. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. The flashing lights outside the building reflected against rain-darkened glass as Emily was carefully placed onto a stretcher. Her eyes opened briefly. The ceiling lights passed overhead one after another as she was wheeled toward the elevator. Then everything faded again. Hours later, inside a quiet hospital room, machines hummed softly in the background. Rain tapped gently against the window. Doctors reviewed test results beneath bright white lights. One nurse looked at the chart twice before handing it to the attending physician. Neither knew that a single line on that report was about to change multiple lives forever. Because Emily Carter hadn't just collapsed at work. She had unknowingly carried a secret that no one, not even she herself, was prepared to hear. The steady beeping of a heart monitor filled the room as Emily slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she did not recognize where she was. White ceiling tiles stretched above her. Soft afternoon light filtered through partially closed blinds. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Then the memories returned. The office. The dizziness. The worried faces. The ambulance. She blinked several times and turned her head toward the window. Rain slid down the glass in long silver lines. Chicago looked distant and blurred beyond the storm. A nurse noticed she was awake and offered a gentle smile before stepping out to notify the doctor. Emily tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy. Not painful. Just exhausted. As though she had not slept in weeks. A few minutes later, Dr. Rebecca Hayes entered the room carrying a tablet. Her expression was calm but thoughtful. The kind of expression doctors wear when they know something important that their patient does not. Emily immediately sensed it. Her stomach tightened. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. Dr. Hayes pulled a chair closer to the bed. "Your vitals look good now," she said. "The collapse appears to have been caused by a combination of stress, fatigue, and dehydration." Emily exhaled slowly. Relief began to settle in. Then she noticed the doctor had not finished speaking. The pause that followed felt longer than it actually was. Dr. Hayes glanced at the screen in her hand before looking back up. "There is something else we discovered during your evaluation." Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. "What is it?" Another brief silence. Then the doctor smiled softly. "Emily, you are pregnant." The words seemed to hang motionless in the room. For several seconds, Emily simply stared at her. She was certain she had misunderstood. "What?" Dr. Hayes nodded gently. "Based on the tests and ultrasound measurements, you are approximately 14 weeks along." Emily's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. 14 weeks. The number echoed through her mind. It made no sense. Or rather, it made too much sense. Images flashed through her memory. The exhaustion she had blamed on work. The nausea she had dismissed as stress. The changes she never paid attention to because she had been too focused on surviving the hardest year of her life. Her eyes slowly filled with disbelief. Not fear. Not panic. Just shock. She lowered her gaze toward the blanket covering her lap. 14 weeks. That meant the baby had already been there before everything ended. Before the divorce papers were signed. Before Jason walked away. Before Vanessa. Before she packed her belongings into cardboard boxes and started over. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Dr. Hayes continued explaining test results, follow-up appointments, and next steps, but Emily barely heard the words. Her mind remained trapped in a single realization. Somewhere between losing her marriage and rebuilding her life, she had been carrying a future she never knew existed. That night, sleep never really came. Emily lay awake in her hospital bed listening to the distant sounds of rolling carts and quiet conversations drifting through the hallway. Every time she closed her eyes, the same number returned. 14 weeks. At 3 o'clock in the morning, she reached for her phone and stared at the dark screen for several seconds before unlocking it. Her reflection looked tired beneath the soft glow. She opened the calendar application and slowly began scrolling backward through the months. June. May. April. Her breathing became shallow as dates and memories started connecting in ways she had never considered before. 14 weeks placed the beginning of the pregnancy during the final weeks of her marriage. Back when she and Jason were still sharing the same apartment. Back when they were still pretending things could be fixed. Emily lowered the phone into her lap and stared out the window. Rain had stopped. The city lights reflected against wet streets far below. She remembered those last months with painful clarity. Jason had become distant long before the divorce. Longer hours at work. More business dinners. More unexplained absences. More silence. Every conversation seemed to end in frustration. Every attempt to reconnect felt one-sided. Then came Vanessa Brooks. Beautiful. Confident. Successful. Everything people claimed a rising executive should want beside him. Emily remembered the exact evening Jason finally said the words she had spent months fearing. "I do not think this marriage works anymore." No argument. No dramatic scene. Just a calm sentence delivered across their kitchen table while a cold dinner sat untouched between them. 6 months later, the memory still hurt. Not because she missed the marriage. Because she missed the version of herself that existed before it ended. The woman who believed loyalty guaranteed permanence. The woman who trusted plans. The woman who thought forever actually meant forever. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Hayes stepped into the room carrying a folder. "I thought you might still be awake," she said with a knowing smile. Emily laughed quietly. "That obvious?" The doctor pulled up a chair. They spent nearly half an hour discussing appointments, nutrition, and what to expect during the coming months. Emily listened carefully, asking questions she never imagined asking 24 hours earlier. Eventually, the conversation shifted. "Do you have family support?" Dr. Hayes asked gently. Emily hesitated. The question sounded simple. The answer was not. Her parents lived nearly 800 miles away in Arizona. Most of her closest friends had families of their own. Then there was Jason. The name remained unspoken, yet it immediately entered her thoughts. Emily looked down at her hands. "I am not sure yet," she admitted. Dr. Hayes nodded with understanding. Before leaving, she placed a document on the bedside table. Emergency contact information. Someone the hospital could notify if needed. Emily stared at the blank line for a long moment after the doctor left. Slowly, almost reluctantly, one name surfaced above all the others. The same name she had spent 6 months trying to forget. Nearly 15 miles away, Jason Miller had no idea that his past was quietly moving toward him again. Wednesday morning began like most mornings in his new life. The glass walls of his corner office reflected the bright Chicago skyline. Emails filled his inbox. Market reports covered his desk. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside a presentation he was supposed to review before noon. On paper, everything looked successful. 6 months earlier, he had walked away from a marriage that felt stagnant and stepped into a future he believed would make him happier. That was the story he told everyone. It was also the story he repeated to himself whenever doubts appeared. Vanessa Brooks sat across from him during a meeting later that morning. Confident as always, she spoke about upcoming projects and potential promotions. Colleagues admired them as a power couple. Friends said they looked perfect together. Even Jason's parents had eventually accepted the relationship, though not without questions. Yet perfection had a strange way of looking different from the inside. As Vanessa discussed quarterly goals, Jason found his attention drifting toward the window. It happened more often lately. Small moments when he felt disconnected from conversations happening right in front of him. Vanessa noticed immediately. "Are you listening?" she asked with a faint smile. Jason blinked and nodded. "Of course." She studied him for a second before returning to business. The meeting continued, but the uncomfortable feeling remained. It had started months ago. Not regret exactly. More like an absence. The realization that excitement eventually becomes routine. The realization that starting over does not automatically solve everything. During lunch, Jason walked alone to a nearby cafe. The sidewalks were still wet from the previous night's storm. Office workers hurried past carrying umbrellas and takeout bags. He ordered a sandwich and sat near the window. Across the street, he noticed a young family waiting at a crosswalk. A man carried a toddler on his shoulders while a woman laughed beside them. The scene lasted only a few seconds before the light changed and they disappeared into the crowd. Yet for reasons he could not explain, Jason kept watching the empty intersection long after they were gone. Back at the office, his phone buzzed with messages from Vanessa about dinner plans. He replied automatically and slipped the device back into his pocket. Then he glanced at an old photograph buried among thousands in his cloud storage. It showed a much younger version of himself standing beside Emily during a summer trip to Lake Michigan. Both of them were smiling at the camera. Jason stared at the image for a moment before closing it. He told himself it was only nostalgia. Nothing more. What he did not know was that while he was trying to ignore old memories, a single name was sitting on a hospital form waiting to change everything. The following afternoon, Emily remained seated near the hospital window when her phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but something told her not to. "Miss Carter?" a woman asked politely after she answered. "This is Karen from Patient Services. We are updating your records before discharge. We noticed that your emergency contact information is incomplete." Emily glanced toward the folded form resting on the bedside table. The blank space seemed to stare back at her. "I know," she replied quietly. "I have not filled it out yet." The woman hesitated. We do have an older emergency contact listed from previous insurance records. Jason Miller. Would you like us to keep that information on file? Emily closed her eyes. 6 months ago the answer would have been automatic. Now it felt complicated. Yet after several seconds of silence, she heard herself say, yes. Leave it there for now. The call ended, but the decision stayed with her. Nearly an hour later, while Jason reviewed contracts inside a conference room, his phone vibrated across the table. He glanced at the screen and almost ignored it when he saw an unknown number. Something made him answer anyway. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time it ended, the color had drained from his face. Is everything okay? One of his coworkers asked. Jason stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. I need to leave. He offered no explanation. 20 minutes later, he was driving through afternoon traffic with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The hospital's name echoed inside his mind. Emily. Hospitalized. Stable condition. Requested emergency contact confirmation. The representative had shared very little, but it was enough. Questions crowded his thoughts during the entire drive. What happened? Was she seriously ill? Had she been hurt? Why had nobody told him sooner? The irony never occurred to him. He had spent months building a life that did not include Emily, yet the moment he heard her name connected to a hospital, nothing else seemed important. When he finally entered the medical center, the bright lobby felt colder than it should have. Nurses moved through hallways. Visitors sat quietly beside vending machines. Somewhere beyond those walls, a woman he once knew better than anyone was waiting. At the same moment, Emily heard a soft knock on her hospital room door. She looked up from the paperwork in her hands. The door slowly opened. For the first time in 6 months, she found herself looking directly into Jason Miller's eyes. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The hospital room suddenly felt smaller than before. Jason stood just inside the doorway, still wearing the same suit he had worn to work that morning. Emily remained seated beside the window, her hands resting quietly in her lap. 6 months of silence stretched between them. You look better than I expected, Jason finally said. The words sounded awkward the moment they left his mouth. Emily almost smiled at the irony. That is a strange thing to say. Jason nodded. Probably. Another silence followed. Outside, the late afternoon sun began breaking through the clouds, casting pale light across the room. Jason pulled a chair closer and sat down. For the first time since entering, he noticed the stack of medical papers on the bedside table. Appointment schedules. Test results. Discharge instructions. Ordinary documents. Yet one folder stood slightly open. His eyes drifted toward it without thinking. Emily noticed immediately. The doctor said I will be fine, she said quietly. Relief appeared on his face. Good. He leaned back slightly. When they called, they would not tell me much. Emily lowered her gaze. I did not expect you to come. Neither did I, Jason admitted. The honesty surprised both of them. For a moment, they simply sat there, surrounded by memories neither wanted to discuss. Then a soft knock interrupted the silence. Dr. Rebecca Hayes entered carrying another chart. She greeted Emily first before turning toward Jason. You must be Mr. Miller. Jason stood and nodded politely. Formerly, Emily said before she could stop herself. The doctor offered an understanding smile. Of course. She reviewed a few discharge details with Emily and then opened the chart. What happened next seemed almost accidental. Dr. Hayes glanced down and said, everything looks very encouraging. 14 weeks is still early, but all indicators are healthy. The room froze. Jason blinked. 14 weeks? Dr. Hayes immediately realized she had assumed he already knew. Her expression changed. Emily closed her eyes briefly. There was no avoiding it anymore. Jason looked from the doctor to Emily and back again. 14 weeks of what? Nobody answered right away. The silence itself became the answer. Confusion slowly gave way to realization. His eyes widened. He stared at Emily. Then at the folder. Then back at Emily again. The doctor quietly excused herself and left the room. The door clicked shut behind her. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Jason's voice finally emerged barely above a whisper. Emily. He swallowed hard. His mind raced through dates, months, memories, and timelines. Then came the question he could not stop himself from asking. Is the baby mine? Emily did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him. The hurt was not in the question itself. It was how quickly it came. Not, are you okay? Not, how are you feeling? Not even, I am sorry. The first thing he wanted to know was whether the child belonged to him. Jason seemed to realize at the moment the silence stretched between them. He lowered his eyes briefly. I did not mean that the way it sounded, he said quietly. Emily looked back toward the window. The fading sunlight painted the glass in shades of gold and orange. Then how did you mean it? She asked. Jason opened his mouth but found no answer. Because deep down, he already knew what the timeline suggested. 14 weeks. The number echoed in his mind exactly as it had echoed in hers. 14 weeks placed the beginning before the divorce was finalized. Before Emily moved out. Before everything fell apart. He sat down slowly and rubbed a hand across his face. For the first time since entering the room, his confidence seemed completely gone. Emily reached toward the folder on the bedside table and opened it. Several pages contained appointment schedules and medical information. One page listed estimated dates. She looked at it for a moment before sliding it across the small table toward him. Jason studied the document. The numbers were clear. The estimated timeline aligned perfectly with the final month of their marriage. The month he spent sleeping on the couch. The month they attended counseling sessions that never changed anything. The month he convinced himself leaving was the right decision. His chest tightened unexpectedly. He remembered small details he had not thought about in months. Emily falling asleep on the sofa after work. Emily skipping dinner because she felt nauseous. Emily complaining about constant exhaustion. At the time, both of them blamed stress. Neither had known. Jason stared at the paper until the words blurred. You really did not know? He asked. Emily shook her head. Not until yesterday. Another silence settled between them. Outside the room, nurses moved through the hallway. A cart rolled past. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang. Ordinary sounds continued while both of their lives quietly shifted. Jason leaned back in his chair and looked at the floor. For months he had believed the marriage belonged entirely to the past. Now the past was sitting in front of him with a future attached to it. The realization landed slowly, but once it arrived, it refused to leave. For the first time since the divorce, Jason stopped thinking about what he had walked toward. Instead, he began thinking about what he had walked away from. Jason left the hospital shortly after sunset, but the conversation followed him all the way home. The city lights blurred past his windshield while the same thoughts repeated endlessly inside his mind. 14 weeks. The dates aligned. The timeline aligned. The memories aligned. By the time he pulled into the parking garage of his downtown apartment building, he already knew the answer he had been trying to avoid. The child was almost certainly his. Inside the apartment, Vanessa was sitting on the couch scrolling through her tablet when he arrived. A takeout dinner sat untouched on the kitchen counter. She smiled at first. You disappeared all afternoon. Then she noticed his expression. What happened? Jason loosened his tie and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. For several moments, he said nothing. Vanessa stood and walked closer. Jason? He finally turned toward her. Emily is pregnant. The room became completely silent. Vanessa's smile vanished. Pregnant, she repeated. Jason nodded. Neither spoke for several seconds. The city traffic far below created a distant hum that somehow made the silence feel even heavier. Vanessa folded her arms. And? The single word carried more meaning than she intended. Jason looked away. The timing. He paused. The timing suggests the baby might be mine. Vanessa stared at him. At first she seemed confused. Then reality slowly settled across her face. For the first time since they started dating, she had no immediate response. Eventually she walked back toward the couch and sat down. The distance between them suddenly felt larger than the entire apartment. Jason remained standing by the window. His thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely. Not toward Vanessa. Not toward work. Not toward the future he had spent months building. He remembered Emily sitting in that hospital room alone. He remembered how exhausted she looked. He remembered the way she quietly slid the medical papers across the table without anger or accusation. Most of all, he remembered the life they once planned together. The small house they wanted someday. The children they occasionally talked about. The vacations they promised themselves they would take when work became less demanding. He had convinced himself those dreams disappeared when the marriage ended. Now he realized they had not disappeared at all. They had simply continued without him knowing. Vanessa finally broke the silence. What are you going to do? Jason looked down at the city lights glowing below. For the first time in months, he did not have an answer. Success no longer felt impressive. Promotions no longer felt important. The future he had been chasing suddenly seemed strangely empty. Somewhere across Chicago, Emily was preparing for a chapter neither of them expected. And for the first time since signing the divorce papers, Jason understood something that arrived far too late. He had not simply lost a wife. He may have lost the family he never realized he still had. 3 months later, spring sunlight filled the hospital maternity wing as Emily stood beside a large window overlooking Lake Michigan. The city looked brighter than it had in years. Maybe because she was seeing it differently. Life had become measured in appointments, tiny milestones, and quiet preparations. A small apartment had slowly transformed into a home ready for a new arrival. Shelves held children's books. A white crib stood near the bedroom window. Folded blankets waited neatly inside a dresser drawer. None of it had happened the way she once imagined. Yet somehow, she felt stronger than she ever had before. Jason remained present throughout those months. Not as a husband. Not even as a close friend. Simply as someone trying to do the right thing after realizing how much he had taken for granted. He attended medical appointments when invited. He asked questions. He listened more than he spoke. The confidence that once defined him had been replaced by something quieter. Humility. Vanessa had moved out weeks after their conversation. There had been no dramatic argument. Just two people recognizing that the future they imagined no longer existed. Jason accepted it without protest. Some losses arrive suddenly. Others arrive through understanding. On a calm April morning, the wait finally ended. Family members gathered quietly in the hospital waiting area. Hours later, a nurse stepped into the hallway carrying wonderful news. A healthy baby girl had entered the world. Jason sat down heavily in his chair as emotion overwhelmed him. For several moments, he simply stared at the floor. Then he smiled. The kind of smile that comes from gratitude rather than victory. When he was finally allowed into the room, he found Emily resting peacefully while holding their daughter. Afternoon sunlight poured through the windows, wrapping the room in a golden glow. Neither spoke immediately. Words felt unnecessary. Jason stepped closer and looked down at the tiny face sleeping in Emily's arms. The future suddenly seemed very real. She is beautiful, he whispered. Emily smiled softly. She is. Several minutes passed before Jason finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been living inside him for months. "Do you think there is any chance for us?" Emily looked at him calmly. There was no anger in her eyes. No bitterness. No desire for revenge. Only clarity. "Jason," she said gently, "I forgive you." His expression brightened for an instant. Then she continued. "But forgiveness and going backward are not the same thing." The room grew quiet again. Jason lowered his gaze and nodded slowly. Deep down, he already knew. Some doors close for a reason. Emily looked down at her daughter and brushed a finger gently across the baby's tiny hand. "I spent a long time thinking losing you was the end of my story," she said. "It was not. It was the beginning of a different one." Jason smiled sadly. For the first time, he truly understood. He had spent months wishing for another chance. Emily had spent those same months becoming someone who no longer needed one. Outside the hospital, the city continued moving beneath the bright spring sky. Inside, a new life had begun. And while Jason carried the weight of regret, Emily carried something far more valuable. Peace. She did not win him back. She won herself.